Okay, so in this episode, the last episode on Marx, we're going to look at some problems with Marx's theory. One problem that I just can't ignore because it is very important, although we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. And another problem that we're going to spend much more time talking about, because it's not just a problem for Marx, it's a problem that reveals issues about how we should understand the modern world. And I think this is, as I indicated right at the beginning of this section of the course, I think this is in part where the value of studying Marx lies. Now, straight away, I want to apologize for the length of this episode. This is a very, very long episode. I'd like to break it up, but I think I actually shouldn't, because it really deals with one topic, and that topic should be seen as a coherent whole. Of course, you can break it up. You can stop watching halfway through and come back later or whatever you like. But I think I should still present it this way. Anyway, I hope it isn't too bad. So the first problem with Marx has to do with his labour theory of value, which is implicit in a lot of the things that I've said, particularly 2 episodes ago. Marx basically assumes that only the worker contributes to the value of a product. So the production of any product, whatever it is, handbag, a beach ball, sofa, whatever it is, only the worker contributes to the value of that product. And the thing is that there doesn't really seem to be any reason to believe this. Even on Marx's own theory, there doesn't seem any reason to believe that only the worker produces any value. In fact, it seems that a great many people contribute to the creation of value, including, as many feminists after Marx pointed out, the women who in the world we're talking about stayed at home and provided food for the workers, and who raised the next generation of workers. Those in Marx's picture, they get completely ignored. And now Marx didn't ignore women in the workplace, but he did ignore women at home. Well, he didn't completely ignore them. There's some, and particularly with Engels was more sensitive to this, I think it's fair to say, than Marx. But the importance of their role was downplayed. And by the same token, one can say that capitalists themselves contribute the value to products, and Marx just doesn't seem to want to allow them any role in this regard, but that seems unfair. Now, it's an open question as to how serious a criticism of Marx's theory of exploitation this is. I mean, it's certainly true that he leaves things out. So when we talk about the production of value, it's a more complicated story than Marx tells. But one might reply on Marx's behalf and say, yes, Marx's theory is overly simplistic, but nevertheless, his theory of exploitation is basically right. It's still true that there's exploitation under capitalism, and that the exploitation is hidden. It's just that there isn't quite as much exploitation as Marx thought, or maybe there are simply many more people being exploited than Marx thought. So Marx didn't properly analyze the way in which women are being exploited under capitalism, for example, and other Marxist feminists and so forth have come along and developed that. So one might say, one could argue that although Marx is wrong about this, nevertheless his theory of exploitation still stands. The fact is that workers are often pushed into lower, to use the jargon of a previous section of this course, workers are pushed onto lower indifference curves by the operation of the market, right? And one might say that Marx was right about that. Now, I'm not saying that that's definitely the right response. I'm just saying that this is an open question. We could debate this. Okay, so that's one problem. The other problem I want to deal with begins with the fact that I mentioned again right at the beginning of the course that Marx made lots of false predictions, and in particular predictions about the revolution from capitalism to communism. Now, Marx and Engels, as again I mentioned earlier, Marx and Engels thought that the revolution was going to happen at various points when they were alive. So they thought it was going to happen in 1830, and the revolutions that occurred in parts of Europe in 1830. They thought that these were going to be communist revolutions, and they weren't. They thought that it was going to happen again in 1848 when Europe was swept by revolution, but it didn't happen. They thought it was going to happen in 1870 with the Paris Commune, but again, it didn't happen. Well, the Paris Commune was defeated. So it didn't happen, and it still hasn't happened. And this, of course, is a very standard criticism of Marx. People say this all the time. Marx's theory is hopeless. He predicted that there would be a revolution from capitalism to communism, and we're still waiting. Now, some people say, yeah, we're still waiting. It's going to happen. But lots of other people, and I have to say myself included, say, no. It's been long enough now. We can pretty clearly say it's not going to happen. At least it's not going to happen as Marx envisaged it. So what are we to say about all of this? Well, this is what Shapiro has to say about it. Shapiro says, Marx did not begin to see that governments can do things to manage weak demand, such as engage in deficit spending during recessions, or straightforward redistribution through taxation from the non-consuming to the consuming. So, in other words, the analysis, the criticism of Marx here is this. Marx, remember, thought that capitalism was going to collapse because, or one of the reasons was there was going to be overproduction. Right, capitalism was going to produce more and more and more and more and more, and yet over time there would be fewer and fewer and fewer people able to buy these products because they would become poorer and poorer. I mean, apart from the very small capitalist class, they would get poorer and poorer. And Shapiro says, well, that didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? It didn't happen, Shapiro says, because the states acted to ensure that it didn't happen. They did things to prevent the crisis of overproduction occurring. They, for example, borrowed money and pumped that money into the economy. They took money from the rich capitalists and redistributed it to the poor, and then the poor could spend that money. So what happened is that the state came to play a role in the economy that it didn't play before, and in that way prevented the conditions from obtaining, the conditions that Marx thought would lead to the revolution. So, and Marx failed to see this. He failed to see that the state could get involved in the economy in a way that would prevent the conditions for the revolution from occurring. Now, I think the first thing that has to be said about this is that there's a sense in which this criticism is perfectly fair. One of the great weaknesses of Marx's theory, despite what people ordinarily think, I've had even colleagues who work in related areas get this seriously wrong about Marx. Marx has no real theory of the state. And now that comes as a real surprise to people, even to people with PhDs and so forth who've worked in related areas. They think Marx's theory is a theory of the state. It's not. Marx has no real theory of the state. Marx's theory is the theory of capitalism. It's not a theory of the state. And one of the reasons for that is in Marx's day, and this is so important, and we have to come back to this again and again in this episode. In Marx's day, the state was not a very important player in capitalism. It wasn't completely unimportant, but it wasn't anything like as important as it is today. So Marx more or less ignored the state, and so it's not surprising to find that he underestimated the role that the state could play in preventing the revolution, preventing the conditions from arising that would lead to a revolution, because he just didn't give enough thought to the state at all. That's a perfectly legitimate criticism. But it's also worth thinking about how Marx might have responded to this criticism if he were alive today, right, and able to respond to not just the criticism, but to seeing what had happened in the economy, how things had actually panned out in history. And I think the first thing that he might say in this context is that he did foresee some of this, though it has to be said that this is a seriously undeveloped aspect of his theory. And here are some passages in which I think we can see some foresight in this regard. So in the Communist Manifesto, he says, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. And Engels in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific says, the modern state is only the organisation that bourgeois society takes on in order to support the external conditions of the capitalist mode of production against the encroachments as well of the workers as of individual capitalists. Now, I'd have to agree that this is not really good enough. There needs to be much more. They needed to have a much more developed theory of the state than this. But nevertheless, there are important points that are made here that are often overlooked in the discussion of Marx. So what we are seeing here is a recognition that as capitalism develops in what we might call late capitalism, by which I'm really talking about, say, the period around 1900, around then, very broadly speaking, around then, the state starts to play a much more active role in the running of the economy. Now, so that wasn't enough. That was just the beginning of what would need to be an appropriate analysis. It was just the start, but at least we can see that there was a start here. There's something else that's very important about this that we see in Engels' passage, the second passage in particular, which I'll just read again. The modern state is only the organisation that bourgeois society takes on in order to support the external conditions of the capitalist mode of production against the encroachments as well of the workers as of individual capitalists. What Engels is seeing here is that the role of the state becomes preserving capitalism, not preserving capitalists, and that there will be points at which individual capitalists try to do things that damage capitalism, and the job of the state in that context is not to support the capitalist, but to support capitalism. In other words, what matters from the state's perspective is the system and not the individuals within the system. And I think this is an extremely important point that unfortunately was almost completely lost in the history of Marxism after Engels, and in particular in Eastern Europe. It unfortunately gets completely lost on Lenin, for example, and as a result, a whole lot of people got unnecessarily persecuted, a point that I'll come back to again. And I just want to give you an example of this, perhaps, that may be illuminating. So I happen to live in a city with incredibly high house prices, or at least we had incredibly high house prices before the current COVID-19 crisis, and no doubt the resulting massive recession that's going to result. So we'll have to see how this all pans out. But we had incredibly high house prices. In fact, one of the highest house prices in the world when you take into account people's income. And for many, many years, the government seemed uninterested in doing anything about this. Basically because it benefited a lot of people who have a lot of power. I mean, basically it benefited everyone who already owned a house. So it benefited the older generations and didn't against the interests of the young, and so on. But anyway, the whole, I could rant about this for ages. I'll spare you that. But let's just say that housing plays a role in the economy of this entire country in a way that it really shouldn't, but nevertheless does. And this is probably not just true of New Zealand. This is true of lots of other countries, but I think it's particularly true of New Zealand. So for many, many years, for decades, no one's really wanted to do anything about this. There's been no attempt to really to change anything. For example, New Zealand's one of the very few countries that doesn't have any kind of capital gains tax in this area. And even very recently, there's continuing widespread support for the status quo amongst a lot of private sector interests. Let's put it that way. For example, obviously the real estate industry, developers, and so on. But it's in recent times become clear that this is actually bad for the system. The high price of housing in Auckland is bad for the system. Auckland is New Zealand's largest city by a long way, and it's kind of the economic hub of the country. And when employers in Auckland started to complain that they were finding it difficult to obtain and retain staff because of the cost of living in Auckland, they simply couldn't afford to pay people enough to allow them to live here. Then the government of the day, which is actually the previous government to the current one, then the government of the day started to take notice, and it started to introduce, both the government as in the narrow sense, but also the governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, started to take notice and implement various changes that we need not go into lending and so forth. That meant that house prices started to, well, you wouldn't really say they declined, but their increase began to slow slightly. So here's the idea. We got to a point in Auckland in which it was still in the interests of some individual capitalists to see the market keep going through the roof. But the government came to realise that that wasn't in the interests of the system. It wasn't in the interests of capitalism anymore. So they stepped in order to prevent any more damage to the system from occurring. So they were prepared to act against the interests of some quite outspoken, capitalists who have access to the media and so on. So they were prepared to step in and act contrary to the interests of those capitalists, but they did so in the interests of capitalism. They did so in the interests of the system as a whole. Another example would be the bailing out of the banks that occurred after the global financial crisis in 2008. So there's a crisis that was caused in large part by the behaviour of banks, of people in banks, subprime loans and so on. And the result was to bail out the banks on the basis that the system needed banks in order to operate. Capitalism requires, modern capitalism, at any rate, requires credit. The banks are the providers of credit, and so it was absolutely necessary for the government to prop up the banks in order to preserve the system. It was done somewhat reluctantly. I don't think this is what should have happened actually myself, but in any case, this was done somewhat reluctantly because everyone realised that the banks had basically caused the problem. But nevertheless, the idea was that in order to preserve the system, the banks had to be preserved because they were the keystone of the system. Okay, so as Engels says, under modern capitalism, the state's job is to maintain the system, and that can be to act against the interests of individual capitalists. It's not there to preserve capitalists, right? It's there to preserve capitalism, right? And that's the key to understanding the nature of the modern state, says Engels. Now this leads to a second point, and that is when Marx was talking about capitalism, he was talking about a system in which individual economic actors competed with each other at an open market, and the state played the job of a referee. And I've got a sort of slide that I don't know whether really helps to understand this, but it might help to get some of the crucial points across in any case. So as you can see on this slide, we have sort of a very small state and a very large private sector. Okay, so in a world like this, the state may have been something like 5%, government spending as a percentage of gross domestic product may have been something like 5%, something like this. A very small state and a very large private sector, and the job of the state in this economy is to referee, as it were, what's going on in the private sector. There's a competition between agents in the private sector, and the state's job is to make sure that that competition is fair. That's the basic picture. Now, what we need to see is that society doesn't exist anymore. Right? The society where there's a small state and a large private sector, and the state's job is basically to referee the private sector, that world is gone. That world disappeared at the end of the 19th century. And during the 20th century, a completely new world developed. The state today is now a major economic player. So in New Zealand, government spending as a percentage of gross domestic product is currently about 40%. In Australia, it's about 35. In Canada, it's about, so a little bit higher, 37, 38, if I remember rightly. In the US, it's just a little bit lower. It's higher than it is in Australia, but lower than it is in Canada. In the UK, it's about between 45 and 50%. So the state is now a huge part of the economy in a way that it just wasn't in Marx's day. And I guess I should remember as I say all of this, when I say government spending is currently running at 40% in New Zealand of GDP, that's actually not what's currently happening right at the moment when we're in lockdown, where it must be 75% of GDP or so. And we don't know, of course, what it's going to be like after all these lockdowns end. It's very likely that government spending is going to, as a percentage of gross domestic product, is going to increase, partly because gross domestic product will decrease very significantly around the world, at least in the short and medium terms. And also government spending looks set to increase as bailouts and support for unemployment and so forth, support for people who are unemployed and so forth increases. So the state is, my prediction, is it's about to get a heck of a lot bigger. It's already big and it's about to get a heck of a lot bigger. One might also think in this context of the existence of what's known as the military-industrial complex, not only in the United States, but in other countries, which is a very significant portion of some economies. It's a very big part of the United States budget, for example. And of course, the amount of regulation of the private sector that exists. Whereas we're not talking about simple common law regulation, we're talking about very specific, often very detailed pieces of regulation that regulate specific industries. What we're really talking about here is the creation of the modern welfare state. The creation of the modern welfare state has introduced a system that's quite unlike the system that Marx was describing in works like Capital and so on. Now, one thing I want to be very clear about at the moment, right now, before we go any further, is this term welfare state. Whenever I talk about the welfare state to my colleagues, they think I'm talking about welfare. So I talk about the welfare state, they think I'm talking about, the dole, payments to people who are unemployed and so on. And what I want to make absolutely clear from the beginning is that welfare is part of, but it's only part of the welfare state. So as I mentioned before, even before the COVID-19 crisis, before the lockdowns occurred, government spending as a percentage of gross domestic product in New Zealand is about 40%. So the government spending is huge in New Zealand, as it is everywhere in the world, nearly everywhere in the world. Well, everywhere in the world it's huge. It's not necessarily the same percentage everywhere in the world, but everywhere it's big. Now, 40% of gross domestic product in New Zealand has not been spent on welfare. Right? It's not been spent on the poor. If it was, there wouldn't be any poor. The fact is that the vast majority of government spending is spent on things other than what we would ordinarily regard as welfare. Okay, and we want to think about what those things are and why it is that the modern economy is like this. But let's first of all have a look at this slide. This slide, I think, captures how people normally think about the nature of the modern economy. Now, when I say normally, I mean this is sort of the general picture that people have in society in general. And even amongst non-specialists. So I have colleagues, for example, who talk to me as if this is, this is the way that the world is these days. So in this picture we have, a big state and still a big private sector, and the state regulates and participates in the business of the private sector, and the state's also involved in redistributing wealth within the community as a whole. And as I say, I think this is the picture that people normally have of the modern economy. We have on the one hand a big state and on the other hand a big private sector. And typical modern political disagreement concerns, it concerns lots of things, but one of the things that it concerns is the size of the state in relation to the size of the private sector. So you get people, the basic division is this. People on the right think the state is too big and want to shrink it, and people on the left think the state's either too small and want to increase it, or at least think that the state mustn't get any smaller than it currently is. So this is sort of the nature of at least one stream of modern political debate. Those on the left say the state's too small, those on the right say the state's too big, and so on. Now, Marx and Engels tell us that this isn't what the modern economy is like at all. Instead, it looks a lot more like this. Now, what I've tried to capture in this diagram is the idea that the state and the private sector are so thoroughly intertwined that you can't separate them. So I've got here a little bit, there's the blue bit on the left where the state is separate from the private sector, and there's the red bit on the right where the state's separate from the private sector, but there's this whole sort of purplish, it's really kind of mauve, I suppose, bit in the middle where the state and the private sector have merged to such an extent that we can't really meaningfully separate them anymore. And I've called that social enterprise. So what occurs in that sector, which is the vast majority of the economy, is not private enterprise, but social enterprise. And I think that's a much more accurate picture. I think, although this is so rudimentary in Marx and Engels, they're only beginning to analyse this. I think this is nevertheless a much more accurate picture of the modern world than the standard view. And what's more, again, as I say, this is one of the reasons that I think it's really worth studying Marx and Engels, because they give us a little glimmer of this truth. In the modern world, the state runs the economy. The state runs the economy in the interests of capitalism, and that completely changes the nature of capitalism from Marx's day. In Marx's day, the state did not run the economy. The economy just ran. Well, it's not even true to say it ran itself. Nobody ran it, right? There were just individual people running their individual businesses, and the state sort of acted as a referee to make sure that they weren't doing so unfairly. But nobody ran the economy. Today, it's quite clear that government runs the economy, and the economy is run in the interests of the system. The major task of the modern state, not the only task, but on this analysis, the major task of the modern state is to control the way that business is conducted so that it is conducted in the interests of capitalism as a whole. And the state has stepped into a whole lot of areas that were formerly occupied by the private sector. For example, classic examples would be education and health. In Marx's day, education and health were largely conducted by private enterprise. If you can hear that, that's rain. It's the first rain we've had in Auckland for ages. Education and health. So in New Zealand, there still is a private health sector, but the health sector in this country is completely dominated by the public sector, and that's true of education as well. Even universities in New Zealand are publicly owned. It wasn't like that in Marx's day. So here again, this is really just a fragment, but here's Engels' analysis of the modern economy. The period of industrial high pressure with its unbounded inflation of credit, not less than the crash itself by the collapse of great capitalist establishments, tends to bring about that form of socialization of great masses of means of production which we meet within the different kinds of joint stock companies. Many of these means of production of distribution are, from the outset, so colossal that, like the railways, they exclude all other forms of capitalistic exploitation. Now again, we mustn't think of this as a kind of conspiracy amongst capitalists to control and own everything. That's not what it is at all. Engels is saying this is how capitalism necessarily develops. So what we get is consolidation within various sectors, and we have an economy that's dominated by very large enterprises. So we could conclude as a result of this that the capitalism that Marx spoke about, the capitalism that Marx analysed in Capital and other works, is dead. It doesn't exist anymore. And, who owns companies these days? I mean, think of this in terms of the passage from Engels that I just read out. Publicly listed companies are owned by the shareholders. Who controls the company? Well, the people who control the company is not the shareholders, but the directors. And this is one of the interesting things about the modern corporation that it wouldn't be right to say that Marx completely ignored, but he certainly didn't spend enough time analysing, and that is this division in the modern corporation between owners and controllers. And there's been an attempt to remedy some of the worst defects of this in recent times, but basically the owners don't control corporations anymore, and so the capitalists aren't running the economy anymore. The economy is run by people other than capitalists. Now again, we're really talking about roles here rather than individuals, because the directors of boards of companies, for example, often are capitalists. They often do own shares and so forth. But nevertheless, in terms of these social roles, you get this split between owner and controller. And we can ask, does the separation of ownership and control between the capitalist and the director mean that our system isn't really capitalist anymore in the sense that Marx spoke about capitalism? And maybe the answer is yes. I'm not saying the answer is yes, but maybe it's yes. This is something to think about. Maybe the system as it currently exists is just not the same system. It's radically different enough from the system that Marx was describing, that existed in Marx's day, to say that we actually have a different system now. In the modern world, individual entrepreneurship still exists. It was a big deal in Marx's day, and it still exists today, but even that looks really rather different today than it did in Marx's time. And one way to tell this, I think the key way to see this actually, is to see what counts as success for an individual entrepreneur these days. And I'm thinking of particular cases in New Zealand recent cases that come to mind. One case involving a company that started producing vodka very successfully, and another a guy producing things like apps for smartphones. The sign of success for these corporations, for these entrepreneurs, is not when they establish a thriving company and it's been going for 20 years and it's now called Joe Bloggs and Sons or something. That's not the mark of success anymore. These days, the mark of success has been bought out by a large multinational corporation, and that's what happened to the cases I'm thinking of. So, for example, this company that was producing vodka, they knew they'd hit the big time when whatever it was, they got bought out for $20 million or whatever. Maybe it was $200 million by InBev, I think it was, which is a major worldwide producer of beer, huge corporation. So the success for an individual entrepreneur now seems to be getting to a point at which you get noticed by the real big boys and they buy you out. That's the modern economy. That's quite different than the economy that Marx was describing. And one might think about an argument that's often made against Marx in this context, the argument that Marx ignores the fact that the capitalist takes a risk and that the capitalist deserves a reward for that. And I think it is true that Marx ignores this, but it's not clear how much of a criticism of Marxist theory that amounts to, or how much of a defense of the status quo that amounts to, because it looks like the people taking the risk in the modern economy are not the large corporations, or at least they're not taking the risks that people normally think of when they run this kind of argument. Anyway, that's again something to think about. Another thing to consider in this context is the collapse of the price mechanism. So I guess we all learn this at school, the law of supply and demand. That's one of the few things I can remember from studying economics at school. Actually, so basically the idea is that businesses will sell where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay, the law of supply and demand and all of that. But at least in many areas of the modern economy, the law of supply and demand is a nonsense. It just doesn't exist anymore. So if you're living in New Zealand, and I think this is probably true for a lot of people living outside New Zealand as well, just think about the sale of petrol or gasoline or diesel or whatever it is that you use in your car or vehicle. It's quite clear in New Zealand that petrol is not set at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Exactly how it is set is a matter of continuing controversy, and there are government inquiries into it and so forth, and it depends who you believe, the industry or the critics of the industry. But anyway, suffice it to say, it's not clear how petrol is priced in New Zealand, but it's pretty clear that it's not set where marginal revenue equals marginal cost or anywhere near it. Another example would be wine. So these are just examples where I happen to know something about the industries, but I'm sure you could multiply this. With wine, the price that you choose to charge your wine, the decision about the price is part of the marketing of the wine. So you don't sell where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's not how pricing is determined in the wine industry. When you think about selling a bottle of wine, you price it, and part of your decision when it comes to pricing is to work out what you want to say about the wine. So just to take an example, if you're going to sell the wine for $15 a bottle, the idea is you're saying it's cheap wine. You're saying it's not very high quality wine. Whereas if you're going to sell it for $42 a bottle, then you're saying it has a higher quality. And so when people make decisions about the price at which they're going to sell the wine, that's partly a marketing decision, right? They're making a decision about what kind of statement they want to make about the quality of the wine. So the idea that it's got about supply and demand, it's not right. It's a much more complicated story than that. And basically, in this area, I think the price mechanism's largely not functioning. And there are lots of areas like this. I think mobile phones is an example. So just to take, this is a pretty crass way of putting it. Crass isn't, it's a bit simplistic, but you can see the point. There was I think this was the iPhone 10, and these figures are a little bit out of date. Now with the what's happening in the world, all figures are out of date. But when the iPhone 10 first came on the market in New Zealand, it was selling for $1,800, but it cost about $550 to get that phone to the shop in New Zealand, get that phone sold in New Zealand. So that included the manufacture of the phone, that included the shipping cost, the marketing, the salaries for people in the stores in New Zealand, and so on. So it cost about $550, but they sold it for $1,800. And that's got a lot to do with where they want to position the phone in the market. Apple wanted to say it was the best phone in the market, and so as a result, they sold it for a lot of money, right? So the law of supply, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the law of supply and demand never operates or anything like that. Of course it does. And of course, it's important to learn it in economics and so on. But nevertheless, I think it is true that there are whole areas of the economy in which the law of supply and demand is completely irrelevant. In fact, the price mechanism, that's really what I'm referring to here, the law of supply and demand and so on, the price mechanism has ceased to operate. And what we have now is what we might describe as managed competition. So we have what we in New Zealand call competition law and what people in the States call antitrust law. And in all countries have these laws. And we talk about these laws, and lawyers talk about these laws as if the point of them was to prevent monopoly conditions developing in sectors of the economy. But Marx would say, I'm sure if he were alive today, he'd say, well, well, how can that be right? Just have a look at these sectors of the economy and see whether we have monopoly or monopoly-like conditions in those sectors of the economy. And there's plenty of sectors of the economy where we do have monopoly or monopoly-like conditions, where there is one, or more likely, a plurality, but a small number of large operators operating. And a classic example of that would be the production of mobile phones. And how many companies are there really that produce mobile phones? There aren't many. There's not just one. It's not a complete monopoly in that sense. But we have monopolistic-like conditions. There are a few companies producing mobile phones. Wine would be another area. So in Auckland, where I live, we used to be able to drive up. There are vineyards that are probably about, let's say, half an hour's drive from where I live. And when I was, say, in my 30s, so let's say 15 years ago, so we would drive up to these vineyards, and there's a sort of a long road with vineyards on either side of it, and you could sort of drive up there and visit each one and buy some wine and so forth. And these vineyards still exist, but they're not separate enterprises anymore. They're now owned. Almost all of them are owned by one of two large companies that are involved in the beverage trade in general. So they produce beer and wine and all sorts. So there's been a huge amount of consolidation in this area. And another area, I guess the most famous area in which this has occurred, is in the media. So in Marx's day, every town, even small town worth mentioning, would have had 5 newspapers or something, and major cities would have had 50 or more, and not only that, they'd publish pamphlets, little booklets and so on. So there was a huge diversity in the media that existed in Marx's day, and that's completely changed all around the world now. I mean, famously, the vast majority of media in the Western world is owned by a very small number of corporations. Now, the point to be made in this context is not the one that you sometimes hear. So people like, for example, Noam Chomsky is famously criticized this consolidation in the media on the basis that it means that there's a great deal of control over the information that we receive. There's a very famous book he wrote about this called Manufacturing Consent. Now, that's very important, but that's not the point that I'm making now. The point that I'm making now is that we think that the role of competition law, the role of antitrust law, is to prevent something that's actually happened, right? And so Marx would say, so we think that the point of competition law is to prevent this kind of consolidation that's happened in the wine industry, in the mobile phone industry, in the media, and so on. But these things have actually happened. These consolidations have occurred. And what Marx would say, were he alive today, is that what we have here is a piece of ideology. We believe that the point of competition law is to prevent consolidation. We sincerely believe that. I mean, we might teach it to our students every year, sincerely believing it. But in fact, this is just a piece of ideology. The truth is that the point of competition law is not to prevent consolidation, but just to manage how it occurs so that it occurs in a way that suits the interests of capitalism. It's not to prevent the growth of what some Marxists call monopoly capitalism, but by which they don't mean exactly the existence of monopoly, but an existence of near monopoly conditions where the economy is controlled by a small number of players. So we say that antitrust law, competition law, is to prevent the development of monopoly capitalism, but that's just an ideology. The fact is, it's there to manage the creation of monopoly capitalism. So one might argue on the basis of all of these considerations that the capitalism that Marx talked about doesn't actually exist anymore. So he was right in a way. In a way, he was right. He was wrong, but in a way, he was right. He wasn't right in the way that he thought. And one might think that this helps to explain the failure of neoclassical economics to actually understand the modern economy. Now, that's a big claim I just made. I claimed that neoclassical economics isn't able to understand the modern economy, but I think that's just an obvious fact about the modern economy. I mean, we tend to forget now, but there were plenty of people before the 2008 global financial crisis, plenty of economists who said that that couldn't happen because we simply knew too much about the economy. Well, it turned out that they were just dead wrong. And I think it is fair to say that modern neoclassical economics has not fared well in explaining what happened during that crash. Now, I've been presenting a partial defence of Marx and Engels, but I want to make it clear that this is a partial defence only. That's all it could ever be. I'm saying that Marx and Engels got stuff really wrong, but they got stuff wrong in a way that if we really try and figure out why they got it wrong, then that will reveal to us things that are very important about the modern world. I'm not denying that they got things seriously wrong. And indeed, it might be worth rubbing this in a bit. I mean, you can see what they got wrong in this following passage. State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous, and then dies out of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it dies out. Well, quite frankly, that's not true. That just didn't happen. The state did not wither away and die out. Exactly the opposite happened. Engels got this completely wrong. And that wasn't just a theoretical mistake that Engels made. It had tragic real-world consequences. I think it's fair to say that as a result of this mistake, that is the failure to appreciate what the state would actually be like under sort of late capitalism, again, by which I mean 19th, early 20th century capitalism, as a result of that, millions of people died. And the reason I say that is because that mistake was carried over into the so-called, at least, communist regimes of Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Lenin, for example, in a book called State and Revolution, repeated and really, I think, amplified Marx and Engels' mistake that we've just analysed. I mean, Lenin said, infamously, that in the end, at the end of capitalism, and again, we're talking about 19th, 20th century, early 20th century capitalism, a cook could run the state, by which he sort of meant by a cook, someone with no training whatsoever in economics or policy making or whatever would be able to run the state because it would all be so simple. And the enormous irony of this is that Lenin wrote this and then very soon after writing it found himself the leader of the largest country on earth and the Soviet Union. And he must have very quickly realized that what he wrote was completely wrong, that in fact it was a hell of a lot harder than he predicted. Now, he may have thought that that was because the Soviet Union's revolution came too early in the, capitalism hadn't fully developed there, and eventually it was going to get easy. And so I don't know. One of the unfortunate things about this is that because Lenin was so busy leading the Soviet Union, he never got to revisit the views that he wrote in places like State and Revolution and so on, and have think again about the predictions that he made in that book. The truth is that they all got this exactly wrong. It turned out that the state was much more difficult to govern and remains so. And on that rather depressing note, I think we should end our examination of Marx. And in the next episode, we'll turn to the liberal egalitarian theory of John Rawls.